On the morning of November 27, 1997, a red Ford Explorer moved through Tijuana with a journalist in the passenger seat. His name was Jesus Blancornelas. For years, he had published what the cartels wanted buried: names, photographs, routes, alliances, and the faces of men who believed fear could protect them from exposure. That morning, fear came for him in the open. 10 gunmen stepped out near the Las Palmas neighborhood and opened fire. The vehicle was torn apart. Glass shattered, metal folded. Blancornella's bodyguard, Luis Valero, fought to protect him and died in the driver's seat. Blancornella survived, wounded but alive. But there was another body left on the pavement: David Baron Corona, the man believed to be behind the attack. A cartel enforcer from San Diego who had once survived a war with El Chapo's assassins, built a cross-border death squad, and helped change the way Mexican cartels used American gang members. He did not die from a rival's bullet. He died from his own side's gunfire, a ricochet that turned back on him in the chaos. How does a man survive a cartel war, build an army, and then die from the same violence he taught others to use? To understand that morning in Tijuana, you have to go back to Logan Heights, San Diego, where everything began with a killing so small in motive and so enormous in consequence. Before David Baron Corona became useful to the Tijuana cartel, he was a 16-year-old in Logan Heights with a distorted idea of respect. He was born in Tijuana and raised across the border in San Diego, in a neighborhood where identity, pride, and survival often lived too close to violence. Logan Heights was not just a place on a map. It was a borderland in every sense: Mexican and American, street and family, opportunity and poverty, two countries pressing against each other through the lives of young men who learned early that reputation could become protection. Baron was short, stocky, and intense. People called him Popeye, but the nickname did not make him harmless. By the time he was a teenager, the street had already taught him that disrespect had to be answered quickly and sometimes permanently. In 1979, according to accounts of the case, Baron saw a man sitting on his car. That was all it took. Not a war, not a debt, not a cartel order. A man sitting on a car. Baron pulled a gun and killed him. That single moment tells you almost everything about the path that followed. In Baron's world, pride had become more valuable than human life. A small insult could be treated like a threat. A teenager's ego could become a death sentence for another person. The court sent him to prison for murder. On paper, that was punishment. Society was removing a violent young man from the street, but prison did not remake David Baron Corona into someone safer. It sharpened him. Behind bars, violence was not treated as a mistake. It could become a credential. The ability to act without hesitation could earn attention. The willingness to hurt someone over respect could make older, more organized criminals take notice. And Baron had something else that made him valuable. He belonged to both sides of the border. He could speak the language of American street gangs and the language of Mexican criminal networks. He understood San Diego, but he was born in Tijuana. He was not an outsider to either world. He was a bridge waiting for someone powerful enough to use him. That is the tragedy of this early chapter. A 16-year-old killer should have been stopped by prison. Instead, prison placed him closer to the people who would turn his worst instincts into a profession. Because if a boy can kill over a moment of disrespect, what happens when powerful men teach him that violence is not just an impulse, but a career? Prison was supposed to interrupt David Baron Corona's life. Instead, it connected him to a larger criminal world. Inside the California prison system, a young man with a murder conviction did not enter an empty space. He entered a hierarchy. He entered a place where street names mattered, but prison politics mattered more. He entered a world where older organizations had already learned how to turn race, loyalty, fear, and discipline into power. For Baron, that world became a second education. He came into prison as a violent teenager from Logan Heights. But behind bars, violence alone was not enough. Violence had to be organized. It had to serve someone. It had to be attached to loyalty, reputation, and structure. That was where he came into contact with the Mexican Mafia, also known as La MA, one of the most powerful prison organizations in California. La MA did not simply control men inside prison. Its influence reached outward. Through taxes, orders, alliances, and fear, It shaped the behavior of Latino street gangs far beyond the walls. For a young gang member like Barron, this was a different level of power. The street had taught him to react. Prison taught him that violence could be planned, directed, and used as currency. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his life. When Barron returned to custody again in the late 1980s, this time in Arizona, another connection pushed him closer to the border war. According to accounts, he met Oscar Paz, the brother of a man linked to the Tijuana cartel. It was the kind of prison relationship that could look meaningless from the outside. Two inmates talking through time, boredom, ambition, and shared criminal language. But in that conversation, a bridge was being built. The Tijuana cartel needed people who could operate where traditional cartel soldiers could not. Men who could cross between cultures. Men who understood American streets but could also function in Mexico. Men with prison credibility, gang connections, and the willingness to follow violent orders. Barron fit that profile almost perfectly. He was not powerful yet, but he was portable. He could move between San Diego and Tijuana, between English and Spanish, between street gang codes and cartel expectations. He was shaped by American prison politics, but rooted in the Mexican border world. That combination made him more than another gang member. It made him useful. And usefulness is one of the most dangerous things a violent man can offer to a cartel. Because once a cartel sees value in someone like that, it does not ask what he could have become. It asks what he can be turned into. By the time Barron walked out again, he was not leaving prison as the same teenager who had gone in for a senseless killing. He was leaving with contacts, reputation, and a path waiting on the other side of the border. When David Barron Corona came out of prison, the border was already changing. Tijuana was not just another city in the drug trade. It was a gate. Whoever controlled Tijuana controlled one of the most valuable routes into the United States, a direct line towards San Diego and deeper into the American market. For the Arellano Felix organization, that plaza was money, power, and survival all at once. But valuable territory always attracts war. The Arellano Felix brothers were locked in a brutal conflict with Sinaloa, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman wanted what they controlled. The fight was not only about drugs, it was about routes, alliances, reputation, and the right to decide who could move product through the border. In that kind of war, traditional street muscle was not enough. The cartel needed people who could operate on both sides. They needed men who could cross into the United States without looking like foreign cartel soldiers. Men who understood San Diego neighborhoods, American law enforcement habits, gang loyalty, and the codes of prison. Men who could speak English in one moment and Spanish in the next. Men who could disappear into Logan Heights, then reappear in Tijuana under cartel protection. Barron was exactly that kind of man. To the cartel, he was not simply violent. Violence was common. What made him valuable was his combination of traits. Bilingual, border-raised, prison-connected, loyal to gang structure, and already proven willing to kill. He could be trained. He could follow orders. He could recruit others like himself. That made him a weapon with a passport. The Arellano Felix organization first used him close to the center of power. Security, protection, bodyguard work. Jobs that required discipline, not just aggression. Barron learned how cartel power moved. The safe houses, the armed convoys, the corrupt protection, the coded warnings, the constant awareness that death could come from a rival, a police unit, or someone smiling too long across a table. He was being professionalized, not redeemed, not rehabilitated, professionalized. That distinction matters. A man who had once killed over personal disrespect was now being taught to place violence inside a larger strategy. He was learning that the border war was not random chaos. It had logistics, it had command structures, it had budgets, weapons, intelligence, and targets. And as the conflict with Sinaloa intensified, Barron's usefulness grew. The Arellano Felix brothers needed more than protection. They needed a new kind of force, one that could blend American gang recruitment with Mexican cartel money. Barron's past gave him access to young men in San Diego. The cartel's resources gave him the ability to transform those young men into something far more dangerous. But before they gave him that mission, he would prove himself in a nightclub, under gunfire, during a night that convinced the cartel he was not just another recruit. He was someone they could build around. On November 8, 1992, the war between Tijuana and Sinaloa entered a nightclub. Christine Disco in Puerto Vallarta was not supposed to look like a battlefield. That night, it was filled with music, lights, alcohol, expensive clothes, bodyguards, and men who believed their money could create a private world around them. Benjamin Arellano Felix was celebrating his birthday. His brothers were there. Security was everywhere. And somewhere inside that crowd was David Baron Corona. To most people in the room, it may have looked like another night of cartel wealth disguised as celebration. But Baron's job was not to celebrate. His job was to notice what did not belong. At around 2:30 in the morning, men began entering the club in a way that felt wrong. They were not moving like guests. They were scanning, watching, taking positions. Then came the uniforms. Federal police, weapons drawn, commands shouted over the noise. But Baron understood almost immediately that this was not a normal raid. It was an execution. According to accounts of the attack, El Chapo's side had sent gunmen disguised as law enforcement to strike the Arellano Felix brothers in a public place. With surprise on their side and the crowd trapped around them, the shooting began fast. The room broke apart into panic. People dropped to the floor, tables overturned, music disappeared beneath gunfire and screams. This is where Baron's value became visible to the cartel. Not because he was noble, not because he was saving innocent people. He was protecting cartel bosses, and that protection would allow the violence to continue long after the nightclub went quiet. In the chaos, Baron moved toward the Arellano brothers. He helped pull them out of the open, away from the line of fire, toward a bathroom that became a temporary shelter. The door between them and the attackers was thin. The danger was close. The room outside was collapsing into confusion. But survival in that moment required movement. A window became an exit. The roof became a path. The brothers were pushed through one after another, leaving behind the party, the smoke, the bodies, and the shock of an attack that had nearly erased the cartel's leadership in a single night. By the time they escaped, the meaning of Baron's role had changed. Before Christine, he was useful. After Christine, he was trusted. For the Arellano Felix organization, trust was never sentimental. It was based on performance under pressure, and Baron had shown that when gunfire started, he could think, move, and keep the men above him alive. That made him more dangerous than a common killer. A common killer reacts. Baron could operate. That night did not make him a hero. It made him an asset. And in the cartel world, an asset that saves leadership is rewarded with more responsibility, more access, and more violence. After Christine Disco, the Arellano Felix brothers needed revenge, security, and a force that could match the war they were fighting. Baron knew exactly where to find the men for that force. He went back to Logan Heights. After Christine Disco, David Baron Corona returned to San Diego with a new purpose. He was no longer just a bodyguard. He was a recruiter. The Arellano Felix organization had seen what he could do under pressure, and now they wanted more men like him. Men who understood the street but could be trained into discipline. Men who could move through American neighborhoods without looking like cartel soldiers. Men who could cross into Mexico, receive orders, return to the United States, and disappear back into ordinary border life. Baron knew where to look. Logan Heights, the same neighborhood that had shaped him now, became his recruiting ground. He looked for young men who were hungry, angry, loyal to the street, and already familiar with violence. But he was not only looking for recklessness. Reckless men create problems. Baron needed people who could follow orders, keep quiet, and understand that cartel work was not the same as neighborhood reputation. The offer was powerful. Money every week, food, housing, weapons, protection. A sense of belonging to something larger than the block. For young men who had grown up with limited options, that kind of offer could look like opportunity. But it was not opportunity. It was conversion. They were being taken from one violent world and placed into another one with more money, more organization, and far greater consequences. In Tijuana, the transformation began. The recruits were housed, watched, and trained. They were taught how to move in groups, how to follow instructions, how to avoid attention, and how to operate on both sides of the border. The cartel did not want them looking like street gang members. Baggy clothes, loud colors, obvious tattoos, and careless behavior created attention. Barron understood that attention could kill an operation before it started. So the look changed. Polo shirts, dockers, clean hair, quiet faces. Men who could pass through a hotel lobby, an airport, a restaurant, or a border crossing without instantly announcing what they were. That was one of the most frightening parts of the model. The danger was designed to look ordinary. This was not the old image of street violence spilling loudly from one neighborhood into another. This was something more controlled, a cell-based force of American gang members funded by Mexican cartel money, trained in Mexico, and able to move across the border with a flexibility many cartel soldiers did not have. Barron did not invent violence on the border, but he helped professionalize a bridge between American street gangs and Mexican cartel enforcement. That bridge changed the meaning of both worlds. For the cartel, American gang members were no longer just buyers, associates, or local muscle. They could become salaried soldiers. They could be given instructions, targets, and rewards. They could be trained to serve cartel objectives far beyond their own neighborhoods. For the young men Barron recruited, the cartel offered status. But status inside that world came with ownership. Once they took the money, accepted the protection, and followed the orders, they were no longer simply Logan Heights gang members chasing local respect. They had become tools in a war between cartels, and tools are used until they break. Barron's force gave the Arellano Felix organization something new. Men who could blend into the United States and serve Mexico's border war at the same time. That made them valuable. It also made them expendable, because the cartel did not need them to survive forever. It needed them to obey long enough to be useful. Soon, that usefulness would be tested in the most public way possible at an airport in Guadalajara, where a hunt for El Chapo would become one of the most controversial killings in modern Mexican history. On May 24, 1993, the border war reached one of the worst places imaginable, an airport. Guadalajara International Airport was not a hidden ranch, a cartel safe house, or a back road where armed men expected to meet other armed men. It was a public space, and families moved through terminals. Travelers waited with luggage. Drivers pulled up to collect passengers. Ordinary life continued under the illusion that certain places were still separate from the drug war. That illusion was about to collapse. Barron and a group of Logan Heights gunmen had come to Guadalajara with one mission: find Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The conflict between Sinaloa and the Arellano Felix organization had already turned personal, brutal, and relentless. To the Tijuana cartel, killing Chapo would not only remove an enemy, it would send a message that the plaza belonged to them. The team waited near the airport. They had information, they had weapons, they had confidence. And confidence can be deadly when it moves faster than certainty. Reports from that day describe confusion over vehicles. A possible target was believed to be arriving. A car was identified. Then another vehicle appeared, similar enough in the chaos and pressure to become the focus of the attack. The shooting began. In seconds, a cartel hunt became a public massacre. Bullets tore into a vehicle that was not carrying El Chapo. People nearby were caught in the crossfire. The gunman fled before the full truth settled over the scene. The man killed in the passenger seat was not a cartel boss. He was Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, one of the highest-ranking Catholic figures in Mexico. His death transformed the incident instantly. A drug war killing was one kind of crisis. The killing of a cardinal in broad daylight at an international airport was something else entirely. It crossed every boundary at once: criminal, political, religious, diplomatic, and moral. Mexico could not treat it as another cartel shooting. The United States could not ignore the American gang connection. The Catholic Church could not accept a simple explanation without asking why a religious leader had been killed in a country already drowning in cartel corruption. The official explanation centered on mistaken identity: wrong car, wrong target, a catastrophic error in a cartel operation. But the controversy never fully disappeared. Church officials and others questioned whether the cardinal had been deliberately targeted because of what he may have known or what he may have been willing to expose. The truth became buried under investigations, competing claims, political pressure, and the fog that always surrounds violence when powerful people benefit from confusion. For Barron, the consequence was immediate. He had helped build a cross-border enforcement team for cartel war, but now that team had produced an international scandal. The very model that made him useful, American gang members serving Mexican cartel objectives, was now impossible to ignore. The operation had not killed El Chapo. It had killed a cardinal. It had killed civilians. It had forced governments, law enforcement agencies, journalists, and church leaders to look directly at the machinery behind the border war. This is what happens when violence is professionalized but not controlled. Men can be trained, weapons can be supplied, cells can be organized, targets can be chosen. But once bullets enter a public place, the outcome belongs to chaos. And after Guadalajara, David Barron Corona was no longer just a hidden enforcer. He was connected to a disaster that made the world pay attention. The cartel could still protect him for a time. It could still move him, hide him, and use him. But another force was beginning to close in, not with rifles, but with paper, photographs, names, and ink. A journalist in Tijuana was watching, and he was willing to print what the cartel wanted erased. By the mid-1990s, the Tijuana cartel had learned how to use fear as a shield. Witnesses stayed quiet. Police officers looked away. Politicians denied what everyone on the street already knew, and many newspapers understood the danger of printing certain names too clearly. But Jesus Blancornelas was different. As co-founder and editor of Zeta magazine, he treated silence as the cartel's most valuable weapon. If traffickers could remain faceless, if their alliances stayed hidden, if their photographs never reached the public, then fear could do its work in the dark. Blancornelas believed that darkness had to be broken. So Zeta published what others avoided: names, photographs, connections, stories about the Arellano Felix brothers, the Tijuana cartel, the violence around the border, and the American gang members being pulled into cartel operations. In a world where gunmen used shadows, Blancornelas used ink. That made him dangerous in a different way. He did not command a death squad. He did not carry cartel money. He did not control a plaza. But he could expose men who depended on remaining unseen. For David Barron Corona, that exposure mattered. He had spent years moving between San Diego and Tijuana, helping build a force that worked best when it remained hidden. Clean clothes, quiet movement, cross-border access. Men who could look ordinary until the moment they were not. Zeta threatened that entire design. When the magazine reported on murders, cartel connections, and the names behind the violence, it did more than inform the public. It disrupted the illusion of invisibility. A man like Barron could survive police pressure, rival gunmen, and cartel war. But publicity was another kind of threat. It made protection more expensive. It made hiding harder. It forced powerful people to answer questions. That is why journalists become targets in cartel wars. Not because they carry more weapons than gunmen, because they carry proof. In November 1997, after Zeta published information connecting Barron to violence in Tijuana, the danger around Blancornelas sharpened. The message was clear enough without being spoken. Stop printing, stop naming, stop exposing, or become the next example. But Blancornelas had built his career by refusing that bargain. He knew what the cartel could do. He knew what had happened to others who crossed the wrong names. And still, he kept publishing. That is the moral center of this story. On one side was Barron, a man who turned silence into power through fear. On the other was Blancornelas, a man who turned truth into resistance through publication. One built a squad to make people disappear. The other printed faces so the public could see who was trying to disappear them. And 6 days after Zeta put the wrong name too clearly into the light, the cartel came for the man holding the pen. Thanksgiving morning 1997. In Tijuana, families were preparing food, setting tables, and waiting for people to come home. At David Barron Corona's house, his own family was waiting too. But a few miles away, another morning was unfolding inside a red Ford Explorer. Jesus Blancornelas was in the passenger seat. Behind the wheel was Luis Valero, his bodyguard and driver, a former police officer who understood the risk of protecting a journalist in a city where the cartel did not forgive exposure. They were moving through the Las Palmas neighborhood when the trap appeared. Gunmen stepped out and opened fire. The attack was overwhelming. The vehicle was hit again and again. Glass broke. Metal twisted. The street filled with noise and panic. Valero reacted with the instinct of a man who knew his job could become his last act. He tried to shield Blancornelis, tried to return fire, tried to keep the journalist alive even as the bullets kept coming. Valero died in the driver's seat. Blancornelis survived, wounded but breathing. That alone would have made the ambush historic. But the strangest death that morning was not inside the vehicle. It was outside it. David Baron Corona was at the scene, the man tied to the very network that wanted Blancornelis silenced. In the chaos of the attack, a bullet struck the pavement, changed direction, and came back toward the men who had brought the violence there. It hit Baron. The man who had built a squad around guns died because one bullet refused to follow the plan. There was no heroic ending, no cartel mythology, no final victory over an enemy. Just confusion, panic, and his own crew leaving his body behind as they fled. At his house, Thanksgiving dinner waited. The man expected at the table never arrived. The fear he had created followed him even after death. For days, his body remained unclaimed, because identifying him meant stepping too close to the world he had served. Blancornelis, meanwhile, lived. He carried the wounds. He lived under protection. He kept publishing. The cartel had tried to erase a witness with gunfire, but the witness survived the storm. Baron did not. That is the coldest irony of his life. He survived the nightclub attack. He survived the border war. He survived years as a cartel enforcer, but he did not survive the violence he helped bring to a journalist's car. A man can spend his life trying to control fear, organize it, train it, and aim it at other people. But violence is not loyal, and on that Thanksgiving morning it turned around. David Baron Corona died on a street in Tijuana, but the idea he helped build did not die with him. That is what makes his story larger than one man. He was not the biggest cartel boss. He was not the richest trafficker. He was not the final winner of the border war. But he represented something dangerous, a new kind of bridge between American street gangs and Mexican cartel power. The cartel gave money, weapons, training, protection, and purpose. The streets gave young men who already understood violence, loyalty, and silence. And the border gave them movement. Baron turned that combination into a model: recruit in the United States, train in Mexico, operate across both worlds, and make violence look organized enough to serve a cartel strategy. His own life ended the way so many lives around him ended, suddenly, violently, and without control. But the damage continued. The Arellano Felix organization would eventually weaken. Its leaders would be arrested, killed, or locked away. The Tijuana cartel would lose much of the power it once held. Yet the blueprint remained because other criminal groups had seen what the model could do. That is why Baron should not be remembered as a legend. He should be remembered as a warning about what happens when prison networks, street gangs, cartel money, and border access all meet in the same man. Jesus Blancornelis survived long enough to prove that truth could outlive the gunmen sent to silence it. David Baron Corona died from a bullet his own world fired, but the blueprint he helped create did not die with him.